Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. That's good. Brothers and sisters of the P&T, do you like kombucha? I really love kombucha. I remember the first time I had it. I was visiting my buddy Ben Wachter in Tucson, Arizona. I don't know. This must have been around 2010 or something. And Ben said, "Hey, have you tried this stuff, kombucha?" And I said, "No, what's that?" He gave me some. And I thought, man, this is just terrific. When I came back east, I would buy some whenever I could find it. I think my family was wondering about my sexuality there for a moment. Like, Lee, do you have something you'd like to tell us? You know that we would be radically accepting. I really like the vinegary kick of kombucha. You know, in the Bible, there's this moment where Jesus is on the cross and the centurions offer him some vinegar to drink. And I used to think, wow, that is just gross. But now I wonder, hold on, were they offering him kombucha? That doesn't sound so bad as a last drink. Now, let's be real. I would ask for beer. Now, with the exception of those times when I find some kind of funky, locally made craft brew, I really don't like it when people go over the top with ginger in kombucha. That's because I'm not tough enough. Like, you won't know this, but Peoples and Things producer Joe Fort has this green smoothie he drinks every morning that is like just full of ginger pulp. But I just don't have Joe's hunkish virility. He also has more chest hair than I do. My machismo meter is just too low to handle all that ginger. It's kind of sad. Of the widely available kombuchas that you can buy at the store, I really like GT's Synergy Raw Kombucha. I've got the GT's Peach Paradise here. Now, you might think that they are paying me to do an advertisement. God, that would be so hot and great. No, I just really like GTs, so I'm doing it the press for free. Oh man, that's just so good. Let's look at the label here. Enzymes and probiotics. 9 billion living probiotics. I don't know, I've heard probiotics are good, so that all sounds like a big plus. Hold on. Does this stuff fit the Whole30 diet? Have you ever met any of those Whole30 people? My God, psychopaths, all of them. Oh, here's the nutrition facts panel. 50 calories in the whole bottle. That doesn't sound too bad to me. 12 grams of sugar with 3 grams of added sugars. Oh my God. My keto friends are feeling completely triggered right now. What is this thing, the nutrition facts label? Have you ever thought about that? One time I said the word ice to myself and I could not convince myself that it was spelled I-C-E. I just couldn't do it. Or like, you can say any word 90 times and you will no longer believe it means what it usually means. Well, sometimes I stare at the nutrition facts label and I'm like, WTF? Where'd this thing come from? What is it? When did it come into being? I encourage you to pull out a packaged food product and stare at the nutrition facts label until it becomes strange to you. Go ahead and pause the podcast if you need to do so. Go for it. This label, what is this thing really? How did it come to be? Well, the good news is I have a book for you. It is Xaq Frolich's new book, From Label to Table, Regulating Food in America in the Information Age. Frohlich is an associate professor of history at Auburn University. In this interview, we talk about how he traced the creation and regulation of the nutrition facts label, as well as how the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's authority expanded throughout the 20th century. We also talk about how the nutrition facts label fits into broader histories of food and government. I had a wonderful time talking to Xaq, and I think you'll get a lot out of this conversation, whether or not you are a lover of kombucha. Hey, get excited! Xaq, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
My pleasure to be here.
So, From Label to Table is a neat book. When you talk to strangers about it, as I think you just have in recent talks, what do you tell them it's about? What were you trying to do with this thing?
Yeah, the interest in this story is I see it as telling a kind of unfamiliar history of a familiar object. People know about the nutrition facts label; they see it everywhere, and in the book, what I'm trying to do is explain how did this weird thing come about, in a lot of different ways. Why is it there's this nutrition information on food? At the beginning of the story, nobody is talking about saturated fats.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of wild thing about studying food and diet culture 70 years ago, is that that was not a common way of talking about foods. By the end of the story, you have this label on all foods. Also, why was this government agency getting pulled into this question as well? So in the book, I describe this as writing a biography of a new 20th century media, the food label. And that's sort of the broad ambition of the book, is to try to explain, what happens when food labels and packaging enter the picture in our foodways, and how does that bring all these different kinds of actors into the story.
Yeah, cool. And how'd you get into it? I mean, so this was your dissertation. You were at MIT, right? And so how'd you get into this? What got you started down this road?
Well, so the story I always tell about how I first got into the question of food labeling was that I had a friend visiting from Europe, and she was, in my kitchen looking at these food products, and she grabs this package, points at the nutrition facts label, and just says, "This is so American." And I'd lived in Europe, and in fact, one of the things I say is this is very much an American story, but I have lived abroad a lot. And I think one of the things I bring to this study is a kind of awareness, like, no, these are sort of distinctively American things. And as I thought about it, part of it was this legalistic culture that I know Europeans always imagine us as this very litigious society where we're just like suing each other all the time and then putting warning labels on our products saying,
don't sue me if you get electrocuted goofing around with this thing.
They joke, like, we would put a label on a banana saying, "Please don't slip on me," kind of.
Yeah, right.
And so part of it was that. Also, at the time, there was no similar kind of label on European products. And it's just weird for them to imagine such a uniform system where every package has the exact same black and white label on it. Like that was just a weird thing. The other thing is that we are a scientistic society, not scientific, but scientistic. We Americans really, especially with food and nutrition, the kind of latest science, the kind of latest diet fad really can take over in the United States in a way that Europeans will often not relate to. And so I think that friend's comment was kind of bringing together these two things. And I talk about this in the introduction of the book, about the sort of scientism and legalism. And that got me interested. I said, what is the backstory behind the nutrition label? And it started off as a kind of term paper, graduate term paper on the actual nutrition facts label in the 1990s. But very quickly, I realized there's a bigger backstory to this. A lot more is going on than just nutrition facts. The FDA is using this label to solve a lot of political challenges with the marketplace.
Yeah, cool. I mean, what I like about that story is it's kind of like rendering strange something that we kind of take for granted by seeing it from other eyes almost, right? Your friends' eyes.
Yeah, recently I was working on an introduction to a series of reviews for public histories of food technology, and in the process, I was kind of reading up on how museum people think about technology. And I remember reading about object-centered histories, and I was like,
Uh-huh.
"Oh, yeah, that's kind of what this book is trying to do." I was like, an object-centered history, but there's this whole debate among museum people because obviously, if you have in a museum this object, use it to kind of think about the symbolism of the moment in time, right? You come in the museum exhibit, you do this. So, in part, in this book, I'm saying, "Hey, let's look at this label and then try to use it as a prism through which to
Yeah.
understand what's going on at the time." But there's this debate about whether you also need to think about object-driven histories. And so I also am interested in how does this food label drive the story? It's
Mm-hmm.
not just a kind of way of thinking about past moments and the kind of preoccupations people have with food. It's also that using the label changes the politics and
Right.
changes the way people engage with it.
Yep. Totally. So, I mean, I wanted to. There's a couple literatures I see you drawn on. We could go on probably all day about this, but one of them is just. I feel like you're part of the food studies world. Is that? I mean, is that fair? So I had
Yeah.
Anna Zeta on, my colleague, and I was thinking about her book Canned when I was reading some of this stuff. So, but is that a world you identify with? Is you hang out in those vicinities?
Yes, definitely. No, I always think of myself as someone who works at the intersections of food studies and STS, or science and technology studies. So, and definitely know about Anna's work.
Yeah. And the other thing is, there's this long tradition of kind of in STS around expertise. I mean, that's a big theme. So like how did that become apparent really? Was that kind of immediately apparent when you started thinking through this issue?
Yes. Yeah. The other kind of way I think about this book is as a story about experts and how they get involved in these mundane things that we wouldn't think about.
Yeah.
Part of that was a sort of a personal surprise of mine. I actually couldn't believe how many people are working behind the scenes on all kinds of minutia of challenges related to food label. And so it was kind of like, how do we tell that story? As an STS scholar, science technology studies people often think they're the only ones who study experts. They are not, and that is not the only kind of expert. And so partly it was a way of saying, in the book, I talk about 3 different kinds of experts, market experts. And so you can see all kinds of interesting ways that advertisers and marketers are kind of framing this product and framing the relationship consumers have with it through the market device of the label. Science experts, and that's kind of really clear with the nutrition scientists in particular, and then legal experts. And I have a background in sort of law and society, and you can see lawyers sort of engaging scientists, consulting with the advertisers and saying, "Hey, this food label is a very specific kind of legal infrastructure, and whatever you want to say about the science, you have to remember that it also has an impact on liability, and an impact on all kinds of sort of legal concerns."
So here, I don't know, maybe you're going to hate this question. We'll see how it goes. But so I was wondering, just kind of before we jump into going through the book and thinking through the history, I wondered how like doing all this work for, I don't know, man, you've been doing this for a decade at least, right?
Yeah.
Like how it's changed how it shaped your relationship to food and thinking about food health and these kinds of things. I remember one of the things back in the day when we were doing Facebook and that kind of stuff. I think I posted like a Gary Taubes, this journalist, kind of sugar as poison kind of expose.
Yes.
I think it was on Eon. And I remember you had a very smart comment that that kind of journalistic world likes these very simple linear tales of like good guys and bad guys. Yeah. And you're like, if we blow it out from an academic perspective, it just doesn't look like that. But then that just raised for me, like, how do you think about these things after, studying this stuff for so long?
Yeah. I didn't read food labels before this project. So, I mean, that's just something I always tell my audiences. And in truth, I still don't really read food labels. I'm also not a dieter. So one of the kind of fun things about this project is like when I give talks, I learn a lot from my audience. A lot of people who come to the talk do read labels.
They're
they read them in
passionate
very
about
specific
this.
ways. Yeah, or they're really curious or desperate or opinionated about, what is good food and bad food. And so they're kind of often educating me about the sort of meanings behind the project. I feel like I was an outsider in a foreign land, and that was sort of the hat that I tried to wear. I'm trying to understand what drives these people. I think that might have made me a skeptic of diet scientists, right? I could have come to this and said, oh, these people are, and there is a critical voice in the book where I'm trying to say, food is way more than just nutrition.
Right.
And there are moments where the label encourages a kind of ideology of nutrition that other scholars have called nutritionism, and this is problematic. That said, I think there's, it's important to be honest about your actors and characters in your story. And the truth is, a lot of the nutrition scientists and diet scientists are sincere in their desire to solve a problem. So I'm not sort of slamming the nutrition science field for its efforts to make sense of this. Gary Taubes falls into this kind of science journalist. I'm debunking the conventional wisdom. And I think a lot of smart people love this genre because it gratifies their sense that, we can be smarter than these other people. And that's sort of how he sells his work. He has a book called Good Calories, Bad Calories. And he starts by sort of debunking the conventional wisdom about how fats, it was all a big, it was all a big lie. And then he goes and he says, it's really about this, right?
Yeah.
And he starts holding up other science. And, as someone who's trained in science studies, that kind of work where you're sort of taking down one and then lift up another is really problematic.
Yeah.
I think the perspective I've gained, I have to tell audiences, I am not a diet scientist. Like, they want me to tell them what's good food to eat.
Yeah.
I would be like, I have data on this, but I want to be clear about what my data says. My data tells me that specific claims about food and diet have changed a lot over the decades. Sometimes they're cyclical in a way that should make you skeptical of any specific claim. Broad general claims haven't changed that much.
Right. And Mediterranean diet, again, it's just like, eat vegetables and whole grains.
Just don't eat too much is the real challenge everyone's having, is really kind of the hard and not satisfying answer, but it's one that's held true. The other thing I can say, and this I think the book talks about, to some extent, is there's a lot of money and vested interest in the kinds of claims getting made. And that just, anytime I hear anything, the part of my head saying, who financed this? Can I believe it? My favorite example of this is that, and it's often secretly, encouraging you and allowing you to feel good about habits that you want to have, whether or not they're healthy.
Right.
So as coffee drinkers, or those of you who drink a glass of wine every evening and are like, it's good for my heart.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting. I mean, the wine one has now gotten debunked finally, where they're saying, no, that is not true. It maybe have small helps for your heart, but it's bad for you in all other kinds of ways.
Yeah.
And I'm waiting for the coffee one. Like, I'm waiting. I love coffee. I love coffee. I love coffee. But it's like, we do things that are unhealthy for us because they do other things for us. And so I think that's kind of what the book is trying to say. Like,
yeah. And do I remember, are you a barbecuer? Is that one of your hobbies? Yes. I am too. I'm a passionate barbecuer.
I'm cautious because being from Texas, like, there are levels of barbecuing, and I am not.
That's true. Do you ever use yours as a smoker? I mean, do you get into that at all?
I do. I mean, not. Let's see again.
Yeah.
I have definitely put wood chips into my grill and put an aluminum plate of water to enrich that experience. I've gone that far.
Right. No, I would never claim to be like a serious barbecuer, because that's just like a whole other level, as you're saying, coming from Texas, as you do. So, why don't you set the background for us a bit? I mean, so, one place we're going is in the 90s, we mandated food labels, but you go all the way back to like the founding of what becomes the FDA. And so why don't you set that scene for us? Like, where's the FDA come from? What was it initially up to? How did government kind of get into the business of regulating food?
Yeah, so in a way, I don't treat the early years of the FDA as much as others have. So the FDA really comes into being from the 1890s to the 19 teens. That's sort of its birth moment. And I mention a bit in the book, partly because I want to point out sort of the weird perspective these early FDA people have. And I want to denaturalize the perspective. It's not that it's weird, it's just that if you think about it in the moment, it's a kind of weird way of approaching food. And I describe it as kind of food forensics because they're trying to hunt out fraud. And there is all of this fraudulent practices, and some of it is by industry with fabricated foods and processed foods, which is what we call them today. And some of it is by these small actors who are just kind of creating wild products. And so they really take this approach of using chemistry to kind of unmask, the food's hidden properties. And that really changes the way you think about fraud. It moves it away from production and the field and into the laboratory and consumption. So that's I briefly touch upon that just because I want to set that up as a kind of interesting aspect of the early FDA years. The story really starts in the 1930s, and this is where I put on my business history hat and say that there is a kind of rise of national markets for manufactured foods that is creating huge opportunities but huge headaches for the businesses. And everybody is having a problem with this. On the one hand, they're trying to create products that, with long supply chains, and they're trying to convince consumers that they're trustworthy and reliable. On the other hand, there are lots of small businesses and regional businesses who are creating similar products that they're competing with, many of which are really bad quality. And so businesses start trying to solve this by experimenting with branding. Like they're really saying, okay, how can we build confidence in national brands? And the label and the package is part of that. But the FDA gets pulled into this because it's concerned about clear public health problems and also what it calls economic adulteration, where part of their consumer protection attitude is if consumers are spending their money on products that have cheap ingredients that the consumer doesn't realize, then that they see that also as part of their mandate. It's not just about health problems, but it's also about lower nutrition or lower quality problems. And so in the 30s, the FDA starts to advocate for newer rules. And that's where you get the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is the beginning of my story where you have the FDA creating food standards.
Yeah, so tell us about what are these, you call them standards of identity. So what are these things, what do they do, what do they look like?
Yeah, the standards of identity, so there are many different types of food standards out there. The standards of identity basically say it's all about the label and the name. So if you have a common name like tomato soup, the FDA would create it would publish a whole range of tomato-related or canned tomato-related standards. And for each standard, they would have a kind of list of different acceptable ingredients. They might even include ranges for those ingredients. And then it may include sort of what are acceptable processes that industry can use and what are not.
Yeah.
And they became a kind of minimal standard. Like you had to meet that minimal requirement. And then there was, the opportunity for industry to adjust their recipes for their consumers. And so the FDA from the 30s to the 60s, they hold public hearings for sort of different ranges of manufactured goods. And they invite stakeholders to come in and testify.
Yeah.
And these are mostly food industry experts, but you get a lot of home economists who are really interested in this. And occasionally you get the sort of more colorful consumer advocates as well showing up to these hearings.
Yeah, one of them popped out. I feel like I've read about Ruth Desmond, sometimes called the grandmother of peanut butter before, but she kind of stands out as she was a housewife who showed up to these hearings for like years and years. Truly incredible.
Yes, she was a homemaker, and she had a homemakers association that she kind of informally ran. It was mostly sort of her sending out newsletters, not unlike contemporary groups like Center for Science and the Public Interest, but she sort of was single-handedly sending out these newsletters saying, be aware of these issues. And then she would show up to the standard hearings. And, she was known and she was colorful and the newspaper loved it.
Yeah, sure.
The book is not exactly a gender history, but gender is big in the story. It's big in terms of who producers and sort of officials imagine to be the consumer. For a long time, they very much imagined it to be the housewife. And it's also big in that there are women who are, through home economics, as sort of spokespersons for women in the home, who are making their way into these sort of official forums and saying, hey, this is what the consumer thinks the food should be. And she sort of does this. She becomes this sort of spokesperson of what the housewife is thinking. And she's, the kind of funny thing is she makes these sort of funny statements about like peanut butter and how everyone knows that, peanut butter should have peanuts in it. And if you put less peanuts, then it might be just like a cold cream. Right?
Yeah. I was going to bring that up.
Colorful.
And I think it was like less than 95% peanuts. Like if you're using more than 5% filler additives or something was her number. So just to give people a sense of what these standards of identity would feel like. It's like, if you're selling peanut butter, it needs to be mostly peanuts, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And this is kind of a tricky thing because on the one hand, in the sort of original legislation, they're talking about, the congressmen are talking about time-honored traditions for making these foods as the kind of goal. On the other hand, most of the foods being made, long before the 1938 Act, are being processed and being made to scale in ways that are nothing like how mom or grandma makes foods.
Totally.
And so creating standards has to kind of accommodate the realities of that industrial production, but also meet this public expectation that the food in its commonplace name would be sort of obviously what you expect it to be.
Yeah, I remember. So one of my favorite toys for a long time, maybe still true, is Google Ngram, where you just throw in a phrase or word to see its usage patterns over time. And I remember one of the ones I used to like to show students is peanut butter and jelly, which like takes off like a rocket right after World War II. So, I mean, the idea that, like there's some kind of backwards nostalgia looking something around peanut butter is just kind of like, it's a fantasy in itself, right? A lot of these things that needed standardization, people perceived to need standardization were actually kind of new and industrial to start with, right?
Yeah, and World War I and World War II had huge impacts, both on consumption, because there were moments where people were trying out new things because of food scarcity. This is important in the story for margarine, but like you say, also true for other kinds of jams and spreads. Also a moment where, especially World War II, you just have people trying to think, how do you pack up and ship foods around the world as a kind of wartime concern for feeding the military? And then they innovate all kinds of things like flash freezing and drying techniques that then become important in the kind of 50s and 60s for convenience foods.
Yeah, I really liked your descriptions about how kind of firms took advantage of the kind of infrastructure and processes that had been built out in World War II for this kind of post-World War II boom movement, which I think we associate with TV dinners and stuff anyway, right? I mean, there's a reason that these things go hand in hand, probably.
Yeah.
So then, you take us into, things start to shift in the 50s and 60s, where you have, you go from standards of identity to controversies around what are called like special dietary foods. So, what were those and what were the kind of sources of controversies around those?
Yeah, there's a very narrow history of sort of the FDA and the American Medical Association around special dietary foods, which is not as interesting. I'll get to that in a second. But there's a bigger cultural change happening that is driving the story. So part of the story is that you have these new industrial foods coming out, and the FDA is struggling with how do you meet consumer expectations, given that these foods are not what would have been foods 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But the other thing that's changing is that Americans are eating a lot of food, and there is what other food scholars have called the nutrition transition taking place. At the beginning, in the 1900s, a lot of Americans weren't getting enough food. And that shaped how we viewed what was good or bad food.
Yeah.
You wanted to have fatty foods. Butter was good for you. Dairy was nature's perfect food. People saw it that way. After World War II, you start to get scientists in the United States saying, hey, actually, there are diseases that are caused by eating too much food, and they're becoming a bigger problem. And so they're starting to make a case that, especially with what was called the diet heart thesis, that Americans are eating too much fatty foods and they should consider eating other foods. So this has big marketing opportunities that companies are excited about. All the vegetable oil producers start saying, hey, avoid animal fats and have our vegetable oils or margarines. So that is driving consumers to start eating differently. It's also showing up on the food label. You have an ongoing diet culture and an interest in thinness that makes certain consumers interested in artificially sweetened foods and low-cal foods. And then even before World War I, you have World War I and World War II, you have a lot of interest in vitamins. And that these might solve sort of hidden deficiencies, subclinical nutritional deficiencies caused by industrial foods or snacking. So there's a big kind of broad cultural shift taking place that create an opportunity for new diet foods. Marketers are interested in this. One of my favorite lines was written by a food journalist where he says that, is called the fixed stomach problem, right? There's only so much you can get people to eat. And so you can't really, it's not a kind of growth market food industry. So how do food businesses convince people to pay more for the same amount of food, or they feel like they can eat more of certain kinds of foods? And diet foods are great for this, right? Drink as much diet soda as you want because it's not going to affect you, right? Or pay more for our artificially sweetened products or for our low fat products as a kind of premium product. So there's that kind of food culture and business strategy in the background. The special dietary foods is a kind of institutional story. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is blend an institutional story with this bigger cultural story. And there you have this problem, which is that the FDA, with the American Medical Association, is trying to make a really clear distinction between food and drug markets. And the problem is that at one time, people are eating all kinds of stuff or using all kinds of stuff to be healthy, and there's all kinds of sort of bad science that they call it, medical quackery. And first the Medical Association and then the FDA get pulled into this project of saying, hey, we don't want to allow people to make these wild claims, health claims. The ordinary consumer doesn't need it. You should see a doctor, see this health expert to solve this problem. So for ordinary things like foods, we're not going to allow those kinds of crazy health sensational claims. And the FDA never fully succeeds at this, but tries really hard in the 1950s to do this a kind of campaign against nutrition quackery to get rid of these kind of the worst examples of this. And meanwhile, it has to accept that for certain people, food is a central part of solving their medical problem.
Right.
If you are diabetic, right, in the 1920s with insulin, you start having diabetics living long lives. They have to avoid sugar. Artificially sweetened foods are worth the potential risk of whatever the artificial sweetener is. And so the FDA creates a category called special dietary foods. And it says that for these foods, again, the idea is that you're talking with your doctor. We're going to allow artificial sweeteners. We're going to allow all kinds of things that we wouldn't want to allow in regular foods. So this kind of institutional concern about the food drug line and the food drug market pulls the FDA into this more public question about, should people be experimenting with diet science and their foods? Should the FDA be kind of telling them, no, they can't do this? And suddenly sort of changing medical opinion about that causes the FDA to look foolish, right? Part of this is that it's initially really skeptical of the diet heart thesis. It's like, this is another diet fad. By the end of the 60s, it starts to recognize, no, low-fat diets are becoming the new preventative medicine approach. And even healthy people today might want to change their diet, right? And might want to consume that health information. And then there's a kind of crisis in the 60s where people discover that there is lots of hunger and malnutrition.
Yeah, I was going to go there. Well, hold on. Let's wait on that for a second.
Yeah, sure.
I had a couple other thoughts on the kind of what you were just talking about. First of all, I mean, one thing that I really like about your chapters is like we're going through. It's like the opposite of a linear history when it comes to regulation, and even kind of like, you know, we'll talk about like the free market anti-regulatory moment in the 70s and 80s in a second, but like mandated food labels don't come till the 90s. So this is not there's no like easy line to draw here about like tracking regulatory, you know, culture or something. And the other thing is you do a really good job of like covering all these moments and then showing industry resistance. So like whatever is going on, somebody's pissed off, right? I mean, because somebody's invested. And so like almost every chapter has like, all right, and here's how here's who was pissed off in the food industry. So I just really like your treatment of that throughout.
I think one of the big lessons that one learns moving into business history is discovering that you can't talk about the food industry.
Yeah,
for example,
exactly.
There's just so many different interests, even within the same company, like Kellogg's. They're going to have departments that love a new nutrition label, and they're going to have departments that hate it.
Yep, totally.
And so it's just very mixed. And as a kind of method for writing history, if you think about a kind of controversy study, it's great because all the people will make the arguments for you. And so they're right there where you'll see the different business interests sort of saying, this is terrible, and others saying, this is great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the intra-class struggles that are most interesting, right? It's like the Karl Marx of the Brumaire, not the Karl Marx of the Manifesto. Like, you want to see like how the rich people are fighting each other, because that's a very important part of these stories. The other thing was just on vitamins and supplements for a second. Like, you know, it's kind of a fascinating. I was interested how it came into your story. It's fascinating because, you know, I think we do have standards of identity and purity and such around these things. But, you know, if we, you know, I go to like the two kind of hippie, kind of co-op-y food places here in Blacksburg, and they still have enormous vitamin and supplement sections with, I mean, they have to be careful about how they do it, but there's still all kinds of really wild claims being made around these things. So like how we still kind of like deal with things on an certain kind of informational level, but there's not broader regulation here is really fascinating.
Yeah, the vitamin story is this whole other sort of stand apart parallel story that I had to kind of weave into the story because it's really important, but it's also just a much bigger, interesting story. So first of all, starting today, vitamins and supplements are the most least regulated product category under the FDA. And there are some really striking moments in the FDA's history in the 1970s with the passage of the Vitamin Supplements Act. Basically, it's the first time Congress passes a law sort of limiting the FDA's authority. And it was a reaction in the 70s against sort of the FDA's efforts to sort of decades-old efforts to kind of restrict the kinds of claims that people were making on vitamins. And then again in the 1990s, after the nutrition facts label was introduced, the Congress passes the Dietary Supplements Education Act, again restricting FDA rules about health claims and such on. So actually, dietary supplements and vitamins are a separate category now from food and drugs, and one that really has very low restrictions. The kind of wild thing about it is it doesn't follow clear political lines.
Totally.
In terms of popularity. You could say it has there's this kind of libertarian streak in American culture that is attached to the vitamin. And maybe that's the kind of clearest way to kind of explain it politically, but even that doesn't work. And so you have these moments in the 60s. One of my favorite quotes is one by Reagan. He's the California governor, and he's campaigning, and he basically says, "Keep your sticky labels off my vitamins," in this kind of moment that gets a lot of press. Where he's basically referring to the FDA and a new rule the FDA is going to have for vitamin supplements, and he's drawing on a real strong feeling. It's easy to laugh about it,
yeah.
but that there's this idea that, hey, I want my vitamin supplements. Don't tell me what's good for me. I know it's good for me. And they kind of defy the paternalistic model of governance that the FDA has. There's a way in which they're too trivial of a matter for people to say, oh yeah, like drugs, we clearly want the FDA involved in regulating that because they can be dangerous, because they have significant life-saving properties. So people accept the FDA, industry accepts the FDA, even wants the FDA involved in that. Vitamins don't fall into that kind of category.
Yeah.
People don't see it as sort of serious like that, but they also don't fall into the FDA is really concerned about economic adulteration. Again, the idea that you're getting cheated out of your money for something that's really not worth it.
Yeah.
And all the evidence in the world suggests that you may get a marginal benefit from vitamins.
Yeah.
But is it really worth the money?
Right.
And basically, there's sort of this idea that, hey, it's what I heard a scholar called surplus health, kind of like the why not attitude.
Yeah.
And eventually the FDA comes to recognize that even though science doesn't support the need for lots of vitamins, people have the money. They have the kind of surplus money, and the possibility of a small benefit is worth it.
Yeah.
And so they kind of eventually that market is just kind of accepted and tolerated by the FDA.
Yeah, amazing. So I wanted to go to that hunger story. I mean, you had a very interesting chapter on this kind of period from 1968 to 1972, where there's this kind of, I don't know, rediscovery might be the wrong word, but there's this kind of recognition that hunger is still an issue. And it's just fascinating how the FDA gets pulled into this, because it's like not, even when you say in the late 1960s, there's this rediscovery that hunger is an issue. It's not like automatically apparent to me that the FDA needs to get pulled into that conversation at all, right? So like, how did that happen? Why it happened? What's going on?
Yeah, the fact that it's not obvious is kind of one of the interesting ways that food gets framed as a policy issue. I don't talk about this in the book. I've talked about this in other places, but in English, we have two different words for thinking about food policy, or two different phrases. We have food security and food safety, and they're often treated like very separate subjects. Food security is about hunger, getting enough food, access to food. Food safety is more sciencey in the sense that it's about risks. And people think of food safety as a developed concern, right?
Yeah.
A developed country should be worried about food safety.
Yeah.
They think of food security as a developing country concern. And people are always surprised that lots of developed countries, especially the United States, have food security problems. It's funny, in other languages, that is the same word. So I learned this in Spanish because I was living in Spain. I was trying to figure out how you say this. And it's seguridad alimentaria is translated as both.
Yeah.
And so depending on the context, you do both. And I feel like that's why in those languages, it's kind of more obvious that they should be going together.
Yeah.
And this shapes the institutional life of these things. The FDA is absolutely involved in food safety. Historically, it is not involved in food security. That is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's concern. And so in the 60s, sorry, this is a long kind of detour from the question.
Yeah.
In the 1960s, you have this moment where civil rights activists are struggling with how to get America to care about the issue, partly because civil rights and sort of, as it sometimes started, like the problem of the African American is getting seen as an urban problem. And one civil rights activist basically realizes that if they can get people to recognize that hunger is happening in both rural and urban areas, and it's clearly a civil rights concern, but it's not only a civil rights concern, that they can start getting renewed interest in this. And so in the civil rights movement, you have this sort of way where they're trying to mobilize around hunger to draw attention to civil rights concerns. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture was absolutely involved in that conversation. So again, you're right. Like, people don't think of the FDA when they think of this. But the FDA at the same time is holding its standard hearings to try to solve, after years of trouble with this, to try to solve labeling questions around special dietary foods.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things it wants to do is put a new label on all dietary supplements that says that Americans are getting enough vitamins in their food supply.
Uh-huh.
And they're going through this and they're holding standard hearings. And in chapter 3 is a kind of weird chapter because most of the time in my book, I'm really looking at conversations happening among experts. Occasionally it makes, the newspapers and headlines, but for the most part, it's a kind of backstage story. That changes in this moment in 68, 69, where it just starts getting public attention. And so industry and advocates start taking advantage of the widespread conversations about hunger in America to sort of shame the FDA on this policy, to say, like, how can you be developing this policy of saying Americans are getting enough when 2 million Americans are not getting enough?
Yeah.
Right. And they're doing this tactically to try to get rid of this label. And in the hearings, it gets ugly. They have, the standards hearings turn into this kind of quasi-legal process where a nutrition scientist comes up, they testify, and then they get cross-examined by industry lawyers, like dozens of them. And suddenly, nutrition scientists who are not used to getting kind of second-guessed about their motives are getting second-guessed about their motives. And so their conversations about what is malnutrition are getting pulled out of context and used against them politically in this bigger political debate. And so this comes back into the question of food labeling with the Nixon administration. To answer the question about hunger, the Nixon administration puts together this White House conference on food, nutrition, and health, which has big legacies for food policy. So the least obvious one is food labeling, although it's really important for food labeling. It's more well known for sort of revitalizing the food stamps program, and it has a lot of other kind of policy outcomes. And that's why a few years ago, the Biden administration held another sort of White House conference on food nutrition, which has now been used to kind of regenerate interest in various food programs. And they did this kind of remembering that 1969 conference. For my story, it's really fascinating because a lot of the people involved in the nutrition labeling debates are in this conference, and there is the kind of closed door conference with these policy people, and then there's just this wild festival of protest happening outside, and the media is sort of covering it that way, the kind of dual conferences in a way. And probably, I was told by editors, don't use block quotes. And so a lot of the rewriting my book was getting rid of all these block quotes. And one of the block quotes was like, I am absolutely not getting rid of this block quote. And everyone who read it was like, oh no, don't get rid of it. Is in the White House report, they ask a lot of the special interest groups who are invited in to attend sessions and then write their own sort of side reports. And the women's group in this basically says, we're just going to ask our participants to share their own responses instead of writing up a formal report. And one of them is this kind of beat style poem where this woman is kind of writing her impressions. And she's just talking about like cold experts with their cold numbers, talking but not explaining. And it's just kind of this beat style quote where you get a real feel of the frustration that the public has, where they don't understand what these experts are talking about, but the experts are not making an effort to understand why the public is upset.
Yep.
So it's a kind of reckoning moment that leaves a lot of the nutrition scientists discouraged and frustrated. A lot of people feeling like the FDA needs to change its policy. So that becomes the kind of impetus in the 1970s for the FDA to sort of start changing its policies on the food label. And interesting for a kind of science studies story of this kind of public understanding of science, right? How do the scientists understand the public? How does the public understand the science?
So then in the 70s, so the food labeling story comes out of this, and I didn't realize there was this earlier kind of voluntary food labeling moment that comes out of the 70s that you kind of connect to. Like, it's interesting how you connect it to kind of like free market ideologies of the time. It's like government's there doing something, but it's not too heavy-handed. And it's informational, basically, right? So, tell us a bit about that story. I was also wondering, like, what the counterfactual is, because I guess it's like, or what the alternative was, because it seems like I can totally see how it's connected to this like free market thinking that you highlight, but it also seems like there's a lot of forces kind of headed in this direction. So like, were there other options on the table, or was it just mandating it? Or yeah, I mean, were there other things people were talking about doing?
Ooh, counterfactual question is a hard one.
Especially for historians. We hate them. I know.
Yeah. I will start by like putting you on the spot and saying, it's funny, you and I were working on projects in parallel at a certain point, and I've always thought that your first book project on moving violations is a very similar story in a kind of broad way to the story I'm telling here.
Yeah.
In a way that's probably not at all obvious to readers.
Right.
In the sense that you have this change in regulatory cultures that's happening in the 1970s. And part of it is that this thing is driving the story. In your case, it's the car and all these safety features. In my case, it's the food package and these informative labels.
Yeah.
And it's also the information fix, right?
Right.
Like how is
totally.
that gonna fix the market problem? So there's a kind of backstory that might help answer this to how I discovered that voluntary label moment.
Yeah.
I was working on the nutrition facts label through the FDA, and I audited a class at the Harvard Law School on food and drug law, because I thought this would be a good way for me to learn how lawyers see this. And the person who taught it is Peter Barton Hutt, who I didn't know at the time is like a living legend in the world of food law. He works at a firm in DC called Covington and Burling, and they represent lots of food industry and drug industry. And I wanted to meet with him and tell him about my project, and so I met with him in his office hours, and I said, "Oh yeah, I'm looking into the history of the nutrition label." And he looks at me and he says, "Oh yeah, I'm the reason why there's a nutrition label." And I'm like, okay, tell me more. And he's like, yeah, we introduced the nutrition label in the 1970s. So that's why that's there. And I was working at the FDA at the time. And this is all true. And he, in some ways, is really important to how the FDA is able to do this. Because he is this guy who has lived food law. He's been in the industry, so he really knows how the industry works. He even has family in dairy farming, and so he really understands changes in the wind related to dairy farming.
Yeah.
Like he gets how Diet Heart thesis has changed this stuff.
Yeah.
And also he's a very sharp lawyer. And so he, as the special counsel, I think figures out ways without new legislation to kind of argue that the FDA can do this.
Yep.
And also he's not thinking incrementally. He's like, we need to really rethink our approach to food labeling. But that said, a lot more is going on than just Peter Hutt in this moment. So there's a little bit of him like, claiming this innovation in a way that isn't actually fair. And so he invites me to go look at his firm's archives, and that was really helpful as a kind of source for information. They have a huge archive. I was talking to an FDA historian who said that no, the Covington and Burling's archives are bigger than ours on the FDA.
Yeah, that's amazing.
In some sense, because of him, because he's this kind of hoarder of information, and they've had decades of work in the food. But the reason why I argue that you have to understand the voluntary label as a kind of market turn or market device is because you have all of these private initiatives taking place already. In some ways, the FDA in 1970 is trying to ask the question, we have no regulatory authority to introduce nutrition labeling, but we like it, and we know people want it. And so a lot of private organizations are experimenting with this. The kind of best example is Esther Peterson, who's this consumer advocate who then, is working with LBJ, but then when LBJ is out of office, she then gets invited to work with Giant Supermarket as their kind of consumerist liaison, and Giant Supermarket experience with the kind of retailing nutrition label that is seen to be very successful and popular, and that becomes a kind of proof of concept that this can work. But the FDA, because it doesn't have the legislative authority to require people to do this, takes the approach that it will be voluntary. And they do this in a kind of legal give and take. They say basically, okay, we've had these restrictive standards that are preventing companies from creating novel dietary foods. If you want to make a non-standard food, we won't penalize it with an imitation label as long as you carry our sort of standard information.
Yeah, they're incentivizing
label.
It. Yep.
Exactly. The voluntary nutrition information label.
Yeah.
And so what this means is that now you can create the kind of dairy substitute product without having to wait for us to create a standard for it, without having to put imitation on it. And imitation was this sort of punitive label that industry was really frustrated by. But you're going to be carrying our voluntary information label. And so when industry complains that this is kind of a power grab, the FDA can say, hey, no, it's voluntary. You don't have to do this. If you want to make the health claim or the nutrition content claim. And then they did this thing that's kind of interesting. And this is where I argue that nutrition is a really key language for this.
This is where I wanted to talk to you about nutritionism. You've used the term, but I kind of wanted to blow it out here. So go for it.
Yeah. They are, on the one hand, arguing that legally the FDA is being objective and this is just an information disclosure, right?
Sure.
We are not telling consumers what is good and bad. We're just simply making sure that information that appears on there is sort of allowing the consumer to make that decision for themselves. On the other hand, they use nutrition as a kind of acceptable form of disclosure, in part because they are endorsing this new kind of diet science. And they create a new standard that they publish with the rules on nutrition labeling for melarine. And melarine is a name they make up for a hypothetical low-fat or vegetable fat ice cream, where the ice cream has had the sort of animal fats removed and vegetable fats placed in it. This was actually an illegal product for decades in America. There were laws in the 1920s and the 1930s that basically said that if you substitute fats, that was called filled milk, and it was considered to be really bad. They were cheap substitutes that the FDA was trying to keep off the market. And the Supreme Court actually overrules this the year before this in the 1972. So it was already, filled milk was already being allowed legally. But the FDA basically says, hey, you could do this. And it's a way to create this sort of in a non-traditional alternative dairy product. And they create the standard kind of to send a signal out to industry. This is what it would look like now with the new kinds of products you can make, but you're going to be carrying the nutrition label and that kind of information on it. So I think that was kind of a signal to the emerging, not just diet food product, but also just all of these substitute foods that today consumers take for granted.
Oh my God. Yeah. Everywhere. Can you just give us just give us a little riff on the notion of nutritionism? Because it's, this is how academics write about these shifts. And so define nutritionism for us. What does it mean and what work does it do for scholars?
Yeah, the phrase was coined by an Australian food studies scholar, Georgie Skrinis. And he has this complaint that the way nutrition science is used, and I think to be specific, he doesn't always keep it specifically, but the way it's used in marketing encourages people to reduce food to just its nutritional properties. And he has an entire book about nutritionism where he breaks down lots of different versions of it, right? He has like whole food nutritionism where you're encouraged to look at a carrot and think beta carotene, where you reduced the carrot to this one chemical. And then he has examples of like nutrient focused nutritionism where you are encouraged to think about kind of a single chemical that could be added into a food to make it better. So there's a lot of different ways nutritionism takes place. But his complaint is that one, it's reducing food to just its nutritional properties. So it's making you ignore all the other different ways that we eat food and think about food. I have this complaint with my students. I'm teaching a class on the Mediterranean diet. And I asked my students, when you think of Italian food, what do you think of? And one student said carbs. And I promise you, Italians don't think of their food as carbs. That's a kind of
right.
The idea that you can think of like pasta as carbs, pizza as carbs, rice as carbs. Like it completely ignores cultural logic around foods. It disembeds it from that kind of cultural context. So that's part of the complaint. The other thing is that it also nutritionism is also not looking at other ways of thinking about what's healthy. And here, Skrinnis's complaint is about how it really helps processed foods.
Right.
And I think that he's right about this in a couple of ways. One, before nutrition labeling really got going, one of the complaints, Ruth Desmond, in one of her complaints, she actually files a lawsuit against the FDA after the introduction of the Nutrition Information Panel. And one of the complaints her association makes is that the label says nothing about whether a food is very processed or not processed, right? You can have nutrients in both.
Yeah.
And the nutrients kind of hide that. And one of the many arguments she makes is like, actually, that's important. This is interesting because here we are 50 years later, and now the FDA is struggling with this.
This is a very hot topic right now. Yeah,
it is right now. There's this question about whether just processed foods, ultra processed foods, are themselves less healthy. The other thing is that nutrition labeling really favors food processing. It's very hard to take a traditional food and rework it based on new nutrition data about what's healthy. You can do that. So like anytime there's a new diet claim about some kind of new thing, it almost immediately shows up on eggs, because whatever you feed chickens will eventually show up in the eggs. So like omega-3s and omega-3s were like immediately showing up on health packages for eggs, because you can do that. But it is harder. You can't do that as easily with traditional foods. It's very easy with processed foods to kind of tweak kind of the way you design them and the recipe to get that. And so there is a way that nutrition labeling, for some people, falsely encourages people to think that processed foods are healthier than unprocessed foods.
Yep. So there's this shift in the 90s when labeling becomes mandated. And one of the things I like about this story, just thinking about it, is, I think that the 90s are often cast as like this high watermark of like, neoliberalism and free market stuff. And it's like, well, it's, but some things happen that just don't fit the mold, right? So, I mean, what happens in the 90s that like this thing finally, the hatchet comes down finally, and it's not just like an incentivized voluntary program, but it's like for the folks who are pushing it. It feels like the time to really go for it.
Yeah, the 80s are a moment in this story where I don't want to say anything goes, but it's kind of a wild west in terms of health claims, and that really creates a lot of concern about the need for clear, better regulated information. So partly there is a kind of sort of funny story about Kellogg's, where in the 1980s and 1984, Kellogg's is excited about the National Cancer Institute running this campaign about dietary fiber and reducing colon cancer. And they approach them saying, hey, we'll give you this big platform for your campaign. We'll put this in all of our cereal boxes, which have dietary fiber, and you'll get that for free. How wonderful is that? And of course, this is a period where sort of public-private sort of engagements are being encouraged by in the federal government. And so the National Cancer Institute is like, this is great. And this completely violates all of the rules that the Food and Drug Administration have about, disease claims on food. And so the FDA is really upset, but the National Cancer Institute is a peer institution, and so they kind of let it go. But from 1984 to 1989, companies run with this. And so you see all kinds of disease claims appearing. You also have the beginning of functional foods. This is sort of the pre moment for functional foods. And again, Kellogg's, not to single out one company, but Kellogg's creates this new bran flake with a new kind of, it's a natural fiber, but it's not a fiber that was appearing in American foods. It was a fiber found in India that was in a lot of dietetic products. And they put it in a flake, a cereal flake product. And the Texas state takes them to court because they say that actually the amount of this fiber in it causes a severe physical reaction, not unlike a drug. And we can all imagine what that is, right? You take a dietary fiber, you eat it, and it causes a strong physiological reaction like a drug would.
Colon blow. Yeah, exactly.
And so they're like, this should be classified as a drug. It is not a food.
Yeah.
So you have this kind of problem that's happening for the FDA and about the breakdown of that food drug line and all these kinds of products. You also have a reckoning now on this concern that's been going on for decades about diet and heart. At that point, it's not so much about obesity as it is about heart disease. People are really concerned about a heart disease epidemic. You have Surgeon General issuing a report in the 80s and other sort of institutions saying this is a real crisis. And so Congress passes in 1990 the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, clearly telling the FDA, give us a label, fix this problem, and giving it the clear mandate to do that. So that's why the FDA is able to, in the 1990s, to say, we are now creating a universal mandated label, required label, and it gets pushed back from industry that's kind of comical, where like Coca-Cola is complaining, hey, people know that Coke is not a diet product. Why do we have to have the nutrition label on it? It also leads to these weird situations where now water bottles a nutrition label, right? 0.00000, right. Which can seem sort of humorous, but actually it's kind of smart for companies marketing because it means that now Diet Coke looks like water. Right. And so water can be marketed as an alternative to other drinks, and Diet Coke can be marketed in this way. So there's a way in which companies take advantage of this new sort of universal label too. And so that's kind of the reason why you get this new kind of growing government involvement on food labeling. That said, there is a kind of continuous neoliberal dimension to this. And the way I frame that chapter, this is a book, I argue, about the information age.
Right.
People
we haven't talked about that yet. Yeah.
People usually use information age thinking 1990s, right? The sort of the internet.
The new economy.
But actually, historians know that the information age, in one sense, in a kind of narrow sense, at least goes back to the 1950s. Other people were thinking about sort of the knowledge economy and what happens when people working with information are driving the economy more. Other historians make a bigger claim saying all ages are information ages. And I try to talk about that in the book. Like, what about this information environment is changing with packaging that explains sort of the food label. But the 1990s is a moment where people are talking about information. They're just information explosion. What do we do about it? Consumers are inundated with information. And so I also try to situate the nutrition facts label as a kind of interesting moment where the FDA is no longer trying to standardize foods. They're trying to standardize information. Right. Like, how do you...
No, it's a kind of hands-off, hands-on kind of thing, right? I mean, it's walking a fine line. And still putting it back on us. I mean, ultimately, that's what labeling is all about, right?
One of the legal scholars writing the same year the nutrition facts label is coming out, Cass Sunstein, hugely influential in terms of sort of ideas of policy. He co-authors a book, Nudge, with a behavioral economist decades later. He writes an article in 1993 talking about informational regulation as this new era of governance. We're going to get away from command and control regulation. We're going to shift to informational regulation. And among the many things, great for me as a person writing about food labeling, among the many examples he talks about is this new FDA nutrition label is a great example of informational regulation.
So, I mean, I want to kind of bring the talk of your book to rest, and, I don't want to give away all its secrets in this conversation, but I think at the end of the book, like, you have this nice chapter on, like, the FDA's decision not to do GMO labeling, which is pretty fascinating because, I mean, I know a lot of consumers who certainly wanted that here in the States. Then they go along with organic labeling. So there's, a kind of like, where do we not go? Where do we go? Then in the book's conclusion, you talk about trans fats, which of course was a big, maybe the last big shift. So I feel like, part of what you're doing in the book is, all right, we've established a system, but then the wrinkles come along. So yeah, I mean, how do you think about these kind of like different things, like once the label's set up and then, these different stories come along?
Yeah, originally I wanted to end the book, at least the kind of right before the conclusion, I wanted to end the book with the nutrition facts label as this kind of triumphant moment where, decades of challenges with this question about health claims and nutrition labeling, and you get the nutrition label and there you are, and now it's everywhere. But there were sort of two problems with that. One is the 1990s, there were two other really big labeling things going on. And it was hard to talk about that. And I tried to fold that into the same chapter and it just didn't work.
Sure.
Which was organic labeling, not with the FDA, but the US Department of Agriculture. And the other is the GM food debate.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to talk about these, but also I don't end the book in a triumphant
not at all. No.
about food labeling.
Right.
And so I wanted to also explain how labels don't always give you more. And that's what made the FDA's policies on GM labeling so interesting. At the same time that one part of the FDA is doing this huge PR campaign saying, we are here equipping the consumer with information, in this kind of pro-consumer mode, you have another part of the FDA saying, we cannot trust consumers with this risk information because they're irrational and they just don't understand sound science. And I just want to explain why that is. And of course, the kind of irony of the GM food labeling story is eventually under Obama, there is a legislation that requires GMO labeling, but it is the opposite of transparency in how it gets implemented, right? People think of the food label as this tool of transparency, and that's like kind of the heart of democracy, right? But in this case, first of all, the USDA decides not to go with GM labeling, which is what everyone knows, but instead to use this phrase bioengineered. So that was clearly intentional to kind of use a phrase that hasn't been stigmatized.
Right.
And then at the same time, the wording is such that it says, well, as long as somewhere on the label in some way a consumer can get this information, it's acceptable. And the food industry is at the same time experimenting with QR codes and the sort of squares that show up on packages that you can scan to get information. And so if a food manufacturer puts a QR code and you scan that and the GM label is there or the bioengineered information is there, that counts. Mm-hmm. So this is like very buried. He was a graduate student who visited and did work here in the U.S. With me. He's in France. He's an economic sociologist. One of his projects was looking at like how industry was using the QR code to basically bury information. Yeah. And so that's a kind of another element to the labeling story that I thought was interesting. There's a kind of huge interest in this in science technology studies. The kind of ugly academic phrase they use is agnotology.
Oh yeah, okay, right.
which is the production of forgetting.
Yeah,
right?
Or ignorance.
How is it people are producing that? And there is a way in which some of the food industry, or in this case the FDA, is using the label to obfuscate, to create less information in a way about the product. So that was kind of why I have that section in there. And bringing it into the kind of conclusions with the trans fat story, part of what was interesting about that is how it shows how the FDA has this infrastructure in place for addressing this new specific science. And there are all kinds of ironies in this story. Part of the reason why trans fats were common in products is because of that 1960s diet heart scare.
Yeah.
By the time the label gets introduced, in other words, by the time the actual companies have to comply with the trans fats label, most companies had already reformulated their products and love it because now they can advertise zero trans fats as a kind of better product.
Yeah.
So they're not actually really losing. And I recently talked about this when someone was talking about the California legislation. One of the kind of interesting things about food labeling is people often think about it as about how people read the label, and that's how it works. But whenever you change the food label, manufacturers reformulate their products.
Yep.
And so even if you're not reading the label, it's having that effect on foods for consumers, whether or not they're reading it. And the recent legislation in California where they ban these 4 ingredients, including a food dye, industry was kind of fighting this, saying, "Oh my God!" But now people aren't going to be able to have their M&Ms or Skittles or whatever. And I was just saying, "I'm sorry, but like, industry has no trouble reformulating."
Yeah, you're going to figure this out. It's going to be all right.
And it's happened several times without people ever talking about it. Right? It's happened in 1990s with the nutrition facts label. It happened again with trans fats.
Yeah.
And it will happen now. It's happening now with the California legislation.
Yeah. Well, that's the label-driven story, as you said. It's like sets up games for industry to play, right?
Yeah.
So what's next, man? I mean, do you know what your next project is? This thing is fresh. So, you totally have permission to just say, I have no idea. But are you thinking about things? What's going on?
Yeah, no, I do have a couple of other projects. One, I've been interested in a while, and I mentioned this class with my students where we're looking at the Mediterranean diet. And so I'm interested in looking at how the Mediterranean diet gets, I don't know if you want to say rediscovered or invented, depending on how you look at it, after World War II. First by public health scientists, then as a kind of regional brand, and in a lot of marketing. And what I love about this project on the Mediterranean diet is it's kind of the opposite of my food labeling, nutrition labeling story. I've been joking for years. I have a lot of friends who are environmental historians, and I've wished I could go to their conferences. And I've joked for years that I should give a paper on a history of placeless food, because the nutrition label story, it's really about how do you talk about food without place.
Yep.
And also, nutrition language is a way of talking about food that, at least on the surface, is not about identity, cultural identity. But a lot of food studies is about identity and place. And so looking at the Mediterranean diet, I'm really interested in kind of digging into that literature, and then this story about how different regional identities get pulled into this project about the Mediterranean diet. I mean, the best example of this is that 100 years ago, nobody on the Mediterranean was talking about a Mediterranean diet. I mean,
they hated each other, first of all. And
they weren't even talking about a Spanish diet. I lived in Spain, and it's the Valencians eat a particular way. Catalonia has its own kind of diet. They might evoke this kind of Mediterranean ethos. They had that kind of in their identity, but they would never have been seeing it as this kind of like unified thing. And so in a way, it's these outsiders. It's an American scientist, and then it's trying to figure out how do you market this around the world that really creates this idea of a Mediterranean diet.
I think it's great, man. I'm just surprised. I remember the first time probably the Mediterranean diet came around, the first time when I was either not alive or not conscious of such things. But I remember the first time it came around in my life would have been like 90s or early 2000s, whatever. But then the staying power of it is just amazing. So it's just like, the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, they'll have like their year roundup of like, what's the best diet to use. And it's just like, still the Mediterranean diet, still this, and so it's just like somehow, I don't know, the nutritionism it's not the nutritionism. Actually, I have a hypothesis. Again, what I like about it is I think it's kind of the opposite of the nutrition story. So one of the things that the diet scientists and the marketers clearly love about the Mediterranean diet is that we think of the Mediterranean as this kind of wonderful lifestyle. Yeah, totally.
And so like scholars looking at this have said there's an element of the North gaze on the South.
Yeah,
First in Europe, right? You have like cold,
I see it,
hungry
man.
Northern Europeans who want to go on vacation on that warm, sunny Mediterranean have that kind of view. And so for diet advice, this is great because you're saying, hey, it's healthy, but it's also fun and
very
pleasant.
Attractive. Yeah.
It evokes this kind of like, sort of ancient Greek and ancient Rome kind of way of life. But there's also kind of problems with that. So for example, the moment where they're studying this diet, probably the population look at were not very affluent, post-war, struggling communities in the southern Italy and in Greece. So no one on the Mediterranean now is really eating the Mediterranean diet anymore. And there's a reason for that. And also, I only really started thinking about this recently. One of my students is doing some research on, she asked the question, why are other traditional and indigenous diets not picked up like this?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm going to try to maintain some sort of naivety about the answer to this, but I suspect the answer is the same reason why we continue to be obsessed with ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It's a kind of Eurocentric bias.
Racial stuff going on. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's easier for you to, for North Americans and Europeans, that Mediterranean is a kind of familiar.
Yeah.
Exotic.
Totally.
Selling exotic.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, this is a familiar exotic.
Yeah.
And so that makes it last through the kind of cycles of exotic foodism and like comfort food cycles.
Did you say you have another one too that you're goofing around with?
Well, the other one is more recent. So in this work on food labeling, I came to realize that packaging is interesting. And packaging isn't exactly the same as the food label because it's very material.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of whole industry of people
creating
food packaging materials and then trying to market it. One of the kinds of source materials that's really fun to work with that you're probably familiar with is business-to-business advertising.
And beautiful,
these food packaging material companies advertise to food companies saying, this is what you can do with this new stuff we have. And so I started looking into that, and just so much is done with food packaging and so many problems come out of it. Food packaging as a waste problem, food packaging as a health problem, right? When it the substances
microplastics and all these kinds of things. Yeah.
But the kind of thing I didn't expect was, as I was looking into it, I was trying to think about what would be a good case study for this. And I'm still not sure I can get access to it to make it a really good case study. But I thought about Coca-Cola. Because so much of Coca-Cola's presence and identity as a company is driven by the packaging.
Yes, the shape.
Well, not just that, but like in the early years, they didn't bottle. And so their relationship to bottlers, they outsourced the cost and the trouble of moving. Because moving glass bottles around was expensive and hard to do. And so they gave their formula to bottler companies and they did the branding, the consumer facing branding, but the bottlers had to deal with the logistical challenges of the bottle.
Interesting.
And then when in the 50s and 60s, they start to realize that new plastics like PET would make it reasonable for them. They start bringing in that production in-house.
Fascinating.
And so they hire a company to do a think tank to do a study of what that would look like. And they were basically trying to think about all of the costs, energy costs, logistic costs of this new bottling process. And I was learning about all of this, kind of curious about this. Well, it turns out that they are one of the two studies that people today say led to the life cycle analysis.
Oh, cool. I can see it. Yeah. Bring a holistic, systematic picture of like everything.
It was not concerned about the environment exactly. It was concerned about sort of the environment as a cost for companies.
Yep, totally.
But then in the 70s, that gets picked up because of the energy crisis.
Yeah.
And in the 80s, there's a similar kind of scientific group in Europe that get concerned about it because of other waste problems.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of ironic path that comes out of this, and then in the 90s.
How
and
dare
2000s,
you take this corporate tool,
No. Well, and so now for like people for companies concerned about the circular economy and concerned about the environmental costs of their food package, this is a really important method.
Yeah.
And I am not at all surprised that it originates with this company's concern about food packaging, because food packaging really is a place that their consumer-facing concerns link to their production and logistic concerns as a company. And so anyway, I'm trying to think about how to turn that into
I love it. These both sound good.
Project.
These both sound good. We win either way. Either if you do both of them or pick one of them, we win. So, Xaq, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. It's been a blast, like I knew it would be.
Thank you. I love the opportunities to chat with you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at sts_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.